Welcome to our author talk by Don Kennedy, former president of Stanford University and also the editor-in-chief of Science magazine. Some of you have received the books that we bought in advance. And I'm here to introduce Chuck Savitt, who's the president of Island Press. I'm an account manager for publishers in the Google Book Search program. Island Press is one of the publishers that I work with. But more importantly, I think, when I was managing web strategy for University of California Press, Island Press was one of the places that I really looked up to. They were way out there in the web world, describing themselves as a destination for people interested in the environment to get all kinds of information, not just books, not just things that they had to pay for, but things that they could share. So I think they're one of the leaders in the area, and very happy to be able to introduce Chuck, who will be introducing Dawn. And please enjoy the discussion. And then at the end, we have a mic up there for questions, and I also have a mic that I can walk around with if people want to ask from where they're standing. All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction and for all the support that you and Google have given to Island Press over the last 4 or 5 years. You've helped us bring our work to a much larger audience and have challenged us to develop our model for nonfiction publishing. Before I introduce you to Don Kennedy, I want to give you all a few minutes of background about Island Press and the context for our publishing of Don's important book, Science Magazine's State of the Planet. Island Press was started 22 years ago to help stimulate, shape, and communicate ideas that are essential for solving environmental problems. We are a nonprofit organization, and we were created with a very different model of traditional publishing. Now, in this room, that doesn't mean very much based on the models that you've shattered every direction you've turned. We were really created to help the environmental community, very broadly defined, activists, people based in think tanks, academic institutions, and others, more clearly develop their intellectual content, the knowledge that emerged from their research, their litigation, their advocacy, their case study work, their economics, etc., to really try to capture that knowledge, a set of skills that by and large the community didn't do a particularly good job at. They were great at their advocacy and their research, but not in really thinking about the broader implications, and never really good at thinking about what the knowledge was generated that could be used beyond the moment of their specific action. We really were created to try to help them do a better job of that, shape it in ways that it could be useful, and get it out as broadly as possible. This was a world that digits didn't exist in yet, and so that it was printed, bound, and shipped in jiffy bags. But it gave us a framework so that when digits came along, we were ready and excited about finding additional ways to spread our information. We now have more than 800 titles in print, which to us is a huge amount, remembering the first few years when we were lucky to get out 1 or 2 a year. But obviously for Google Books, it doesn't even fill a tenth of a server. We have become the leading, with that few number of books, nevertheless, we've become the world's leading environmental publisher, focusing on sustainable development, climate change, biodiversity restoration, and environmental health. Our authors include some of the world's leading technical scientists and economists, but also some of the world's leading visionaries on environment, like E.O. Wilson, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, Bruce Babbitt, to name just a few. In working with Google over the past several years, we've redefined ourselves, and more importantly, we've tried to redefine our authors to get them to understand that publishing is not about simply writing and publishing a book, but that their job begins at the point that the manuscript is first finished. And we try to get them to understand that publishing now for us is first in print, then in person, and then online. And our work is to try to get them to commit to that model of publishing from the first day that they bring us their ideas. Don Kennedy has been one of the test cases for this new model. And that's appropriate for those of you who know Don or anything about him. He's been one of my heroes for the past 20 years, and he's been one of the more extraordinary, it's been one of the more extraordinary and interesting careers that I could imagine. After completing his doctoral work at Harvard in biology, he moved west to the biology department at Stanford and quickly grew from being a professor to provost to ultimately the president of the university. During that time as president, and I know many of you were at Stanford when he was there, and since, most of the openness and creativity that's happened on that campus in the last 20 years is a result of his tenure. He probably won't say this, but his result is the tenure of president, in which he dramatically changed the curriculum and opened up it to other cultures and other ideas and created the free and open environment that stimulated a lot of the kinds of work that's flourished in Silicon Valley. He's also been at the forefront of the nexus of the role that science plays in establishing public policy. And that's one of the places where he has brought both his incredible academic career, a career in government where he was the commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and his work at Stanford to really, I think, the central focus of what we're about and what the book, Science Magazine's State of the Planet, is all about. That intersection, or what Don likes to call the collision of science, policy, and politics, is something that I think is incredibly important for the era that we're in right now, where politics is regularly interfering with science and trying to tell science what it should and shouldn't do. And when science presents very strong facts on a whole array of issues that don't line up with either certain corporations' policies or government policies, there's efforts to try to stifle it. And I think that one of the things that Don has been able to do in his current position as editor-in-chief of Science Magazine at the American Association for the Academy of Sciences is really try to work hard to reestablish what science is and how it performs, and to present the best quality information on Earth. And so Don is somebody who I think comes from a history of understanding how challenging it is to do the best science and how important it is to share both the changes of understanding as people go through the scientific process and to bring that to light in the public policy arena. One of the things that we've been doing with Don as part of our new model is putting him out on the road to talk to editors, producers, business and civic groups as part of the in-person part of what we do as our publishing model, to really, again, try to take people who think they understand what science is, but their last science class was probably when they were a sophomore in high school, to really re-educate them about the critical issues of our time and the role that science can play. Island Press is honored to have published Don's book, and I'm honored to consider him a good friend and to introduce him to you today. So thank you very much.
Well, even a guy my age can really feel right at home in a place like this. And I probably ought to start out by telling you how you changed my life. I've always said that Google, well, always. Google hasn't been here for always, has it? Google is a huge assistant for the lazy scholar. But Google is also doing another thing, and it really matters to me because I write editorials and I occasionally write reviews, and I need the helpful services of somebody that used to be in every major newspaper newsroom in the country, a person called a fact checker. You guys are putting them right out of business. I don't know what fact checkers are doing. I think they're founding ethnic restaurants, or they're discovering other interests. But I don't think a newspaper newsroom needs a fact checker anymore. And so I want to salute you as someone who is a shameless user of what you provide. And now I want to start talking about the book a little bit, but let me say first of all that not only did Chuck and Island Press prove a very good place to take this idea, but I got terrific help from a really outstanding group of scientific colleagues. The editors of Science, the people who do the peer review on the manuscripts that we get at about 12,000 a year, are people who've done PhDs in science fields and had postdoctoral fellowships, and some of them have even had faculty positions before coming to us. They like what they do. They like being at the center of a particular disciplinary line. And what they liked very much to do in this case, when we put together State of the Planet, is to pick out some contributions that they particularly respected that reflect not just where science has taken us, but where science has taken us with respect to particular issues that are important in the survival of the kind of life and the kind of planet we have. So it's been a joy to put this together, and a joy to have Island Press publish it. They've been, I must say, a wonderful crystallizing surface for a host of good ideas about how to make environmental science into good policy. And that's a topic on which we need all the help we can get these days, because some of the forces, alas, are in the other direction. Well, let me give you a little bit of reassurance before I occupy this chair instead of that rather stuffy podium, and report to you that I'm not really here to sell you the book, but I want to explore some ideas that I think flow pretty naturally out of the book and the effort that we made in creating it. We tried to put together the most authoritative articles that we could find, and we would have boxes, you may have seen them if you've glanced at the book, from news reports that the news science writers that are employed at Science and produce in the front of the magazine, a mix of scholarly articles and commentary from the news. We focused on a variety of subjects that are really important to the state of the planet. Land use and land cover change, the special problems that tropical forests face in anticipation of climate change, marine fishery resources, water availability, and of course the closely linked topics of climate and energy policy, because you can't have one without the other. Every time you start talking about climate and solutions to climate change problems, you're immediately involved in a discussion of energy, types of energy, and energy use. So obviously we hope that State of the Planet as a book and as a course, I'm happy to report to you that there is now an interdisciplinary course for undergraduates at Cornell, which has the title State of the Planet and which uses this as a text. And I hope maybe we'll persuade more institutions to do that as well. So I hope it will do science education in this society some good. But my hopes are actually a little more outlandish than that. And let me say how. In a remarkable instance of what Malcolm Gladwell has called a tipping point, we've just seen a moment in time at which the steady march of good science and powerful consensus among the scientific community has really turned public attitudes about a major future problem around. 20 months ago, let alone 5 years ago, there was not a very strong public sentiment that climate change is really something to worry about. That has changed in a remarkable way, and it's a change that has not been brought about, as many have in the past, by either intellectual elites or political opinion leaders. It's come about instead because of the relentless march of science. Good science being done, good science being published where people can read it, good science being published where people can read it and then paid attention to by good science writers who are capable of making the translation to people who don't have particularly strong scientific training on their own. So it's really it's really the march of science that has done this. What kinds of science? Atmospheric chemistry and physics. Paleoclimatology, as it's reconstructed through taking cores from Greenland or Antarctic ice caps and creating isotope ratios that give a climate proxy of what it was like at the time horizon from which that part of the core is taken. Other kinds of temperature proxies in coral and other places. Measurements from satellites and Earth stations of temperature change over time. Sophisticated computer models of the relationship between greenhouse gases and average global temperature, some of them confirmed by backcasting over the past 100 years and then applied to predict what might happen in the next 100 years. I don't want to drone on and on about how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change used that science to create the remarkable consensus documents that it created, but that is the consensus. And now I think the small denial community that is, I think, in large part worried about the economic cost of doing something about the problem, has largely retreated. Senator Imhoff still believes that it is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on the public, but I don't think people are listening very hard to that anymore. So I, perhaps rashly, entitled a recent editorial of mine in Science, Climate Change, Game Over. I did not mean that the game was over politically, and we will get to that in a little while. But I do think the game is over in terms of what science has done, and in particular, what science has done to the majority of public opinion in the United States. I specify the United States not to exclude anybody else. Let me tell you that in our closest comparisons that you can make with, for example, the United Kingdom, we are way behind. The awareness about climate change and, in fact, announced government intentions to make, including economically expensive inroads against it, has Britain well ahead of us. And in fact, the activity of Tony Blair in promoting the UK view of climate change even brought him to California to negotiate. Who knew California was a nation? He's negotiating with Schwarzenegger about climate change. It was I thought, a rare moment. By the way, another illustration of the fact that when most of the people want something to happen and the federal government appears not to want it to happen, you get a downward jurisdictional migration in which states and even cities look at what mayors have done with respect to reducing civic carbon footprints. So there's a kind of new political reality that has come about as a consequence of all that change. So the big political question that will be before us in the United States, in my view, is whether we will undertake serious political mobilization in the interests of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, a few minor ones, in the interest of reducing the liability to global warming. There are potentially expensive steps to do that, and there are some not so expensive steps to doing that. And the objective is really twofold. First, to deal with a continuing ramp of slow warming, which in all of the models looks to reach somewhere between 2.5 and 5 centigrade degrees by the end of the century we're in. And the models also predict continuing episodes of the kind that we have seen relatively frequently over the past 10 years, considerable droughts here and there, landslides and flooding problems in other places, extreme weather events, in short, that are outside the normal continuum. They're the tails of distributions, and it looks as though we're getting more of the tails, whether they're droughts or whether they're hurricanes or flooding. So that's one possibility, that the accumulation of greenhouse gases, which, as we have seen, has raised the level of carbon dioxide from about 280 parts per million by volume in the pre-industrial age to about 385 now. Does that continue with consequences, especially at high latitudes in the Arctic, as we have already seen? Or is there a second possibility? That is that there's a possible tail of much more catastrophic possibilities that could arise if, as we think possible but don't fully understand, that increasing ramp of average global temperature intercepts a threshold from some nonlinear dynamic event. And the ones prominently mentioned are the collapses of large major ice sheets. That's one possibility. There could be the blockage of the North Atlantic thermohaline conveyor, which transports heat from the equator up into high latitudes and depends on being able to have a sinking component at the end of that trip that travels deep water back down to the equator. If that is blocked, either because there's intense dilution of the northern waters so they can't sink, or if they are prevented from becoming colder so they can sink, that could produce that effect. But as you can see, there's some speculation in that. Reasonable people can create excellent models and hypotheses that make those look like serious possibilities. And right now, when you consider what to do about climate change, you look at the risk profile either in terms of gradual change or in terms of a threshold and something more risky and perhaps more costly. Whichever, it's absolutely clear that the American public has come to believe in the seriousness of this problem. So there should be, one would expect, a fairly significant political mobilization pushing to change the way we deal with that problem. Any resolution is going to depend on some interaction between our concern over the threat posed by climate change and the search for a national energy policy that has multiple objectives, of which climate is one, but of which clearly now in the political equation, energy independence is another. So the focus on energy is surely going to produce some new directions in our research strategy and in our economy. Some research is going to emphasize the need to treat fossil fuels in an environmentally sparing way somehow. One dimension is surely going to be improvements in efficiency and economy. You doubtless know that California has been a national leader in this regard. Over the past several years, the per capita production of greenhouse gases per Californian has stayed flat, while that in the nation as a whole has gone up steadily. So there's plenty of evidence that policies, even at the state level, can produce significant effects in the direction of improvement in efficiency and economy. A second is going to be a major effort on research for sequestration of carbon, cleaning up, driving coal or oil use into more carbon efficient, less carbon intensive uses. A third will be a heavy research focus on such alternative sources as solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear. Parenthetically, although nuclear power has been politically off the table for some time, it is now coming back on because enough people are seriously worried about climate risks so that they're now looking at this as a risk-risk comparison rather than as an essentially unacceptable solution. So that's an indicator of how seriously the climate problem is regarded. Even thoughtful and environmentally sensitive liberals are now expressing something far closer to acceptance, albeit with some limiting provisos, of nuclear power. Finally, and centrally for my purposes this afternoon, there are some enthusiastic and robust markets for alternative fuels. I want to point out that research on alternative fossil fuels that could continue our commitment to internal combustion power as in the transportation sector is a real possibility. It's at the very center of energy and climate bills now before the Congress, and I think it's worth particular attention in terms of what we might change. Before starting to talk about alternative fuels and so forth, let me say one thing, and that is that there's already a major energy improvement that's available in the transportation sector without doing anything else except changing purchasing power. Hybrids that are extremely efficient and high-performance vehicles are out there ready for anybody to buy. People are buying them in increasing numbers, but in rather special areas. Somebody notes the Prius is a blue state car. That is where people have started to worry seriously about this kind of problem. That's been reflected in the automobile market, but not in most parts of the country. But there's a lot to be had there, and presumably minor adjustments in the tax structure or other things could help with that. But efforts to reduce fuel consumption by other means, either mandated addition of oxygenates, remember MBTE, which was there for a while and then went away because it had other problems. Now the discussion, of course, is about ethanol, not merely as an oxygenate added to gasoline, but as a serious substitute. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that problem because it's something that's of great interest to people who take climate change seriously or who take energy seriously. But the enthusiasm for corn-based ethanol is a perfect example of how we might very well take a path in our enthusiasm that has some serious problems associated with it. So here are the facts, many of which you probably know. The price of corn at planting time in the United States got to around $4.25 a bushel. Nobody had ever seen a price like that for corn at the start of the planting season. It dropped back down after a while to something substantially less than that, but more than the $2 or $2.25 or $2.50 that American farmers had gotten used to. So what would you do if you were running a farm in the tallgrass prairie of mid-America and you discovered that those prices? You would plant more corn. You would plant a lot of it instead of soybeans, recognizing that you'd have to come back to that ground and plant soybeans, which do add nitrogen sometime, but you could do that later. You could take some environmental set-asides now and plant them if you could do it on the basis of the rule. And so a lot of things are happening in the tall grass prairie of mid-America that weren't either very environmentally sound or might have other effects. There are lots of questions here. The first question is, can we ever achieve the kind of production that the Secretary of Energy thought we could? He thought 31% of the transportation fuel sector in the United States, the automobiles, could be ethanol. Lots of doubt about whether we can get there. Furthermore, there's doubt about whether this turns out to be a gain net for climate change. Consider that most of the 100, last time I looked, refineries to make ethanol out of the corn are being set up not in Illinois and other parts of the tall grass prairie. They're out west in the short grass prairie because there are a lot of conveniences to having them on cheaper land and having them in places where the remains of the fermentation process can be used as cattle feed. So there are feedlots developing around these refineries. So that means the corn has to not only be grown in soil tilled by tractors that use fossil fuels and protected by pesticides that are made from fossil fuel feedstocks and so forth, then trucked to the refineries where the refining process with its own built-in inefficiencies goes. So the question is, how much carbon dioxide have you actually saved by putting an ethanol, a gallon of ethanol with that history into a car instead of a gallon of fossil fuel with the same history? And the answer is you'd have to put more in to get the same power out, and that makes the equation even worse. So the math is not very encouraging about that. There might be a net gain. If there is one, it's probably very, very small. And so one really does wonder about that. Well, there are other alternatives. There are other ways to get sugar. You can get it from sugar cane. That's the way the Brazilians do it. The Brazilians get all of their alcohol that they use in transportation from sugar cane. That refining process and extraction are both energetically cheaper than the corn process. So you might say, why don't we go to Brazil, where a quarter of the transportation fleet uses sugarcane alcohol, and import some of it for ourselves? Well, that would be nice if it were a bargain, but we like to protect our own farmers. So there's a protective tariff on it, and we can't get it at a price that most people want to afford to pay. So there's biodiesel. There's in the Southwest Pacific, largely in Indonesia. There are large-scale conversions of tropical forests into palm oil plantations. You can drive a diesel truck on nothing but palm oil, but in the course of getting the palm oil and extracting it, you've spent some energy, and once again, the net gain isn't immediately clear. But that's not the main problem. The main problem is that a remarkable thing has happened as a consequence of our enthusiasm for substitute transportation fuels. We have suddenly linked the energy economy with the agricultural economy. That never happened in the past. But now you have to confront two different realities about the relationship between income and how we spend that income. If you look at the relationship between food prices and income, what you discover is that after a certain point, there's no increase in the marginal expenditures for food. If you are really rich, you go to lots of gourmet restaurants, you can find ways to spend quite a lot on food, but there's a limit to it. On the other hand, if you track energy use as a function of income, it keeps right on going up. Okay? So what situation do you have in a coupled economy of food and energy? In rich countries, purchasers who no longer need to spend an increased marginal amount of their income on food are very happy to buy a car and put corn-based ethanol in it. That jacks up the price, the world price of corn, and the people in poor countries who spend large marginal fractions of their income on food can't afford it anymore. So my agricultural economist friends have a new worry. The new worry is, will this historic relationship of population growth and stability of food prices be maintained now that we've linked the world agricultural economy to a different kind of economy that has different effects on rich and poor? I might mention one other thing. With all of these schemes, it's almost impossible, at least for me, to detect what the externalities might be, what the side effects that we've not looked around the corner to see might be. I mentioned earlier that a lot of those Midwestern farmers are deciding that they're not going to plant soybeans this year because corn is doing so well, and we would like to plant more corn and make more money. Well, people notice things. And later this spring, soybean futures on the commodity futures market in Chicago. Don't you believe, by the way, that Brazilian farmers don't look at the commodity futures market? They're a big soybean producing country, and if they see a spike in the soybean futures price, they're going to plant more soybeans. Do you know how they plant more soybeans in Brazil? They cut down forests to make room to plant more soybeans, or they use new incursions into the Cerrado community to do that. So there are all kinds of unexpected fallouts, externalities, economists like to call them, when we make quick adoptions of schemes like the one I've been talking about to get us out of our climate and energy fix. Well, where do I come from? I'm a little concerned that we may be stuck for a good long while, at least, on fossil fuels, and that we're going to have to direct our policies to a kind of two-part solution. The first will be focused on new technologies for dealing with efficiency improvements and so forth. Here in Silicon Valley, I know you hear all kinds of talk about clean tech. There's a clean tech exposition seems to occur at very regular intervals. I think that they ought to pay a lot of attention to the really ugly energy source that's in our portfolio, and that is coal. It's the most carbon intensive. It's the most problematic. I think the good news is there's a lot of coal, and the bad news is that it is extremely carbon intensive. But I think we need we need to pay attention to the fact that the way the world is going, not just here, but also in Russia, where they're exporting their supplies of natural gas because it brings in cash flow from richer countries, and they're meeting their own energy needs by building coal-fired power plants. I mean, that's not a good trade for the environment, although it may be a very good trade for the oligarchs. So do something about coal. If we could tame the carbon intensiveness of coal, it would be a huge plus. I don't know what the level of activity on that is now. I hear people talking about it much more seriously than I used to, and so one can hope. The second direction is much less technological, and it's more in the realm of political economy. What can be done to mitigate emissions? And naturally, there are competing versions of what should be done. I might characterize the first version as the Bush version. It's to press for long-range research programs, which have the advantage of not asking anyone to shoulder an immediate economic burden. It can be supplied. In the Congress, we have two tracks. Both are involving what are called cap-and-trade programs, like the cap-and-trade program that succeeded to limit acid rain by limiting sulfur dioxide emissions from a relatively small number of sources in the middle of America. That was a big success, but doing a cap-and-trade for carbon dioxide is going to be harder. There's not a limited number of sources, and there's not an easy set of detectors that can be monitored on a national basis. But there could be, and I think there's a strong push to solve those problems so that we can do cap and trade. There are two versions. One of them is modeled on the old McCain-Lieberman bill that came, they thought, encouragingly close to passing 2 years ago. Now it has rather less support, but it's still out there, and there is a very strong group of people who strongly favor cap and trade with a hard cap, no exceptions. Senator Bingaman and Senator Specter have a competing bill that is also a cap-and-trade bill, but there's an insurance program in it. The insurance program is that if in the cap-and-trade system the price rises to an amount that producers simply can't sustain, the government will make additional permits available at $12 per permit. Presumably, that would be higher than the start-out cost of them in any system in which they were either distributed or auctioned. That's a kind of insurance. It amounts to a $12 a ton carbon tax. Many people think it's too cheap, a carbon tax. That if you're going to give them an insurance policy, you ought to give it to them at a substantially higher level. But I think you're going to see in science soon a debate between a proponent of the Bingaman approach and a hard cap enthusiast, Fred Krupp, the head of environmental defense. That's going to be a very interesting issue to follow as the Congress makes its way along toward an energy bill. And here we are. They're back. And they're now starting to legislate seriously. There's a House bill and a Senate bill. The House bill doesn't have fuel economy standards built in. They're pleased that the Senate has it, but then the Senate bill has to be conferenced with the House bill, and Congressman Dingell, who serves his Detroit constituents well, is going to be in that conference. So I guess anybody who likes politics ought to really enjoy this season, because if Dingell on the one hand and Pelosi and Waxman on the other hand have to resolve the problem of how much we do with respect to legislating fuel economy standards and thus hurting some people, it's going to be interesting to see how it turns out. I am lousy at political predictions, so I'm not going to make one. I'm simply going to confess my weakness in that domain and encourage you to keep abreast and follow what's going on, because what's going on, I think, in the next few months is going to tell a great deal about the future of the whole energy climate mix in this country. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll have questions. There are microphones. That's one back there.
Anyone with questions, please go ahead to the microphone, or I have one here too.
Hi. So when you said that the game is basically over in terms of the consensus for climate change, there is one outlier whom I've been very curious about, and that's MIT's Richard Lindzen. I don't actually know anything about his science. Could you give us a sort of a quick summary of where he comes from and what you think of it?
Lindzen is smart. Like most full professors at MIT, he's really smart. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, so he has the respect of his colleagues. He has had questions of various kinds about the IPCC data on climate change. I must say that within the last 2 or 3 years, I have seen no peer-reviewed paper from Dick. I think in some ways his colleagues would like to see him make a really serious scientific attack. He has, however, been publishing pieces on the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, and I guess I would rather see him debating it in the literature. But he is a respected person. I mean, that's what I can tell you.
I like that you mentioned the externalities of different forms of energy. I wonder if you think that all the talk of carbon and global warming is a problem in that it's overshadowing other environmental concerns like pollution and extinction and things like that.
Yeah, that's a legitimate question. I tend to see the set of environmental problems as a portfolio rather than as really separate channels for trying to make things better. I don't think that carbon emissions abatements are likely in any future I can readily project to take money or resources or attention from other environmental. It's not going to compete with the Endangered Species Act. It's not going to compete with the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. But to the extent that the public focuses on it and gets all excited about polar bears and Inuit communities and so forth, it may be harder to get their attention about other things. That's the only problem I see in that regard. Yes?
You mentioned the linking of agriculture and energy adversely impacting poor countries, which indeed we've seen with the tortilla crisis. I was wondering, though, if in the long term that could go the other way, because the third world also supplies a lot of the food that's grown, and it increases the value of agricultural exports, and so it's one more thing that they can sell to the first world for energy.
I think if there is a substantial base in the developing world of crops, exportable crops for energy production, and they could get an economic benefit from that, that would be nice. I don't see, except for palm oil in Indonesia, I don't see a significant move to create such an exportable asset in the developing world. And where I worry is about Africa, where you've got a bunch of smallholders, and in bad times they really do have to augment what they grow, particularly maize, with local purchases, and it's going to become very expensive for them to hold their lives together. So I'm more concerned about them than I am hopeful about the other possibility. But it's a good point.
I have a question. On the corn ethanol issue, I've also heard about switchgrass. Is that something that at least isn't edible and so wouldn't have the problem of conflict with food?
I only remember my astonishment at hearing switchgrass out of George Bush's mouth before I knew anything about it. I said, "My God, he's really a botanist," and I had no idea. There are some advocates for switchgrass that you could, but I think you've got to get. It's not a source of sugar, or you're going to have to get to cellulosic digestion, and I think in the end wood chips are going to be better than switchgrass, but you never can tell. we ought to try everything. We ought to try everything.
Another question. You mentioned hybrid cars, but I wonder, considering how little of the energy used in the U.S. used in transportation is by consumers and just driving their personal cars, I was wondering whether you really think hybrid cars are that important, and whether you think the power is more in awareness than in actual carbon emission offsets.
Is probably a fair amount in each. I think it does send a kind of signal to people to start thinking about their own choices and their own behaviors. I never actually assault from the safety of my Honda Civic Hybrid the driver of the Hummer who parks next door, but I've been known to make a comment. Well, yes.
So with oil hitting $80 today for the first time, can you make any comments on peak oil theory and how that might impact the political discourse?
Yeah.
For those in VC, the question is, with oil hitting $80, what impact does that have on political and economic discourse?
Particularly the theory of peak oil.
Yes.
Peak oil.
I don't know much about the theory of deep oil. You mean the hypothesis that there is an as yet untapped source from considerably deep in the Earth's crust, and would that provide a significant incentive to try to reach it?
No, basically the concept that we've reached the peak of production.
Well, that is such an interesting and old argument, and I see papers on it all the time, and I never can decide who is right. But I do think that we're closer to maximum output than most people would have thought 5 or 10 years ago. That much I believe.
I need to ask, my question's going to sound somewhat skeptical, and it's not really intended that way, which is, it seems like within at least the popular press of science, scientists need to shout and use hyperbole to be heard. I mean, I remember back when I was growing up, I was told oil was going to be running out by the year 2000, and it clearly hasn't. And each year there's a new disaster theory, and most of them don't pan out. And yet you claim that global warming seems to have reached through to the public. What's kind of the evidence that this really has reached through the public, and this isn't just that the public's just not treating this as yet another catastrophe that's not going to happen?
Well, the only way you can do that is ask them in good polls, and I think there have been enough well-constructed polls that show that substantial majorities, over 60%, not only believe that it is a serious problem, but believe that the government ought to do something fairly serious about it. As to the other, one of my closest friends since the time I got to Stanford has been Paul Ehrlich. And when he wrote The Population Bomb, he made a lot of predictions that didn't come true. He predicted famines. There was a substantial, in the early 60s, gap between the projected population growth and reasonable projections of whether the food supply could keep up with it. And that was viewed as a hyperbolic and out there prediction. But the population movement has drawn an awful lot from what Paul wrote then, and from what Paul has written scientifically also. So, at the end, you have to decide whether that was just a wrong claim, or whether, in fact, the claim indeed had a result that the author of the claim hoped very much that it would have. I don't know. I think some scientists are pretty strong about expressing their views where those views bear on policy. And I think they should do that cautiously and thoughtfully, particularly if they're a little bit outside their own field. It certainly does the scientific community no good if, on account of some hyperbolic claims, there's a loss of public trust and credibility of the whole venture, and that's certainly something we don't need.
Today, and a very big round of applause for Don Kennedy, please.
Well, thank you very much.